Third speaker on today's panel on regional is Professor James Harrison. He's a professor of environmental law at the University of Edinburgh School of Law, where he teaches international law of the sea, international environmental law, and environmental law. He has published widely on these topics. He also regularly provides advice and consultancy to governments and international organizations. Professor Harrison will address us on marine environmental protection in the Southern Ocean, a unique experiment in regional cooperation. Professor Harrison, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Judge Chatter. Can I join my fellow panelists in thanking the organizers of the conference, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Korea, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the Korean Maritime Institute for the invitation to participate in this event. I've been lucky enough to participate in these conferences before, and I've thoroughly enjoyed every single trip to Seoul. So it's a real regret that I can't be there with you in person today. But seeing as I can't, I thought I'd just share with you a little bit of Edinburgh. We had our first sprinkling of snow this morning, and this was the scene that greeted me as I came into the university. Very festive, I hope you'll agree. My focus today is going to be on integrated marine environmental protection from a regional perspective, by which I mean the protection of marine ecosystems from all relevant threats and in relation to all relevant actors. And in order to explore this theme, I'd like to take a particular case study of the Southern Ocean. Now, I want to stress at the outset that I'm not using this as a typical regional regime. It is, in many senses, unique, not only because of the particular species and habitats that are found on the Antarctic continent and the surrounding seas, but also for the legal and political arrangements that have been put in place over many decades in that region. These institutions, as I'll explain shortly, have a particular mandate to promote marine environmental protection and an emphasis on ecosystem integrity. And they've taken many innovative actions over the years in pursuit of that mandate. So in a sense, they are leaders. But this is also the key point of my presentation, that despite the legal mandate they have and despite the implementation of that, there remain significant challenges in this region for integrated marine management. And so I want to use this case study to explore what the opportunities for integrated management that have been taken in the region, but also those problems that arise and potential ways in which we might try to overcome them. I'll start with a short overview of governance in the region, and it's centered around the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which operates according to the basic principle that Antarctica should be used for peaceful purposes only. All claims to sovereignty over the continent shall be suspended. And critically for our purposes, the treaty sets up an institutional framework through which states cooperate to further the values inherent in the treaty. And that includes environmental protection. The treaty applies to the area south of 60 degrees south latitude, including all ice shelves, which means in practice it covers many parts of the marine environment. The treaty is also supplemented more recently by a protocol on environmental protection, the so-called Madrid Protocol, adopted in 1991, which gives an even greater emphasis on environmental protection and ecosystems. And in its own words, it's designed to set up a comprehensive regime for the protection of the Antarctic environment and dependent and associated ecosystems, expressly recognizing the intrinsic value of Antarctica, and it purports to designate Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. This protocol introduces a number of important rules relating to the protection of the environment, both in Antarctica and in the surrounding waters, and it has annexes on environmental impact assessment, the conservation of Antarctic flora and fauna, waste disposal and waste management, the prevention of marine pollution, including pollution from vessels, another example to build on Professor Prof's example of a regional approach to vessel source pollution. It also has an annex on area protection and management, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And finally, the latest annex on liability, although that is not yet in force. These two treaties are supplemented by the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which, whilst in some senses focusing on fisheries management in this region, from the outset has had a much broader mandate to consider ecosystem impacts of fisheries and broader biodiversity issues in the region. In many senses, it was a leader in promoting an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. And the convention explicitly has an objective of not only preventing the decrease of harvested populations to levels below those which ensure its stable recruitment, but also to maintain ecological relationships between harvested, dependent, and related populations of Antarctic marine living resources, and the prevention or changes or minimization of the risks of changes in the marine ecosystem which are not potentially reversible over 2 or 3 decades. And I think this emphasis on ecosystems distinguishes this organization from many other regional fisheries treaties, certainly in place at the time when it was negotiated, and arguably it still goes further than many other RFMOs today. Just for the sake of completion, there is also the 1972 Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, whose purpose is given away by its title, and I'll say not much more about that. Now, it's important to recognize that although these are presented as a system, and that language is explicitly used, they are in fact independent treaties. Each institution has a slightly different mandate and they have different memberships. Nevertheless, there are certain common key features across these governance institutions in the Southern Ocean. As I've already indicated, there is a strong emphasis on environmental principles and particular emphasis on an ecosystems approach in all of these instruments, as well as the decisions that are adopted under the institutions created by them. And this is another key element of the regional framework. Each treaty creates its own institution, which meets usually on an annual basis. And there are a significant number of resolutions, measures, and other guidance adopted by the parties to give effect to the objectives of each of these treaties. Now, one thing to note about the institutional framework in the region is it is based upon consensus decision-making, which essentially means that each party has to agree before a measure can be adopted. In the past, this hasn't prevented significant progress being made on many issues, but we may have to revisit that conclusion today, because certainly when we come to marine protected areas, which I'll talk about more in a moment, there have been significant challenges over the last decade in making progress on designating MPAs in the Southern Ocean. And consensus has sadly been lacking. The other key element of the regime, which is explicit in all of these treaties, and which I want to particularly emphasize for the purposes of my presentation today, is that there is an express recognition that in order to achieve the objectives of each of these treaty regimes, these institutions cannot do that alone. And there is a need to engage with non-parties, both directly and through competent international institutions. For example, in this respect, the Antarctic Treaty says in Article 10 that each of the contracting parties undertakes to exert appropriate efforts consistent with the Charter of the United Nations to the end that no one engages in any activity in Antarctica contrary to the principles and purposes of this treaty. An almost identical language is found in Article 22 of the CAMLAR Convention. And it's this element of integrated management at a regional level that I really want to talk about in the second half of my paper. because although we have dedicated regional institutions with a particular emphasis on ecosystem protection, there are, in fact, many voices that can be potentially talking about ecosystem protection in this region. There are three elements to this that I want to explore in a little bit of detail in my presentation, and I do go into a bit more detail in the written paper I presented in advance. That's very much work in progress. Firstly, there's the element of different voices even within the region, within the Antarctic Treaty System, and a need to promote cooperation and coordination between particularly the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting and the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Secondly, there are other global bodies which have a mandate for particular issues, and those bodies may need to be brought into conversations if we are to achieve integrated management, even at a regional level. And the one that I would highlight later in the presentation is the International Maritime Organization as a clear example, with a mandate for shipping globally, again, as Professor Prof has indicated. But there may be other global institutions also with a mandate who may need to be brought into discussions about integrated management within this region. Finally, there's a slightly different issue about ensuring compatibility between measures taken in the Southern Ocean and adjacent regions. This is particularly evident in relation to fisheries, where fish stocks may not necessarily be exclusively located within the area subject to the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. They may go into other areas of neighboring regional fisheries management organizations, and so there may be a need for the Commission to work closely with these other bodies. And in fact, as I'll say in a moment, it does so. Starting with cooperation and coordination within the Antarctic Treaty System. The relevant treaties take two separate approaches to this question. In the first place, it places particular obligations on parties to respect obligations under the other treaties in the system, regardless of whether they're a party to those other treaties. This is most clear in the CAMLAR Convention, which requires that parties to the CAMLAR Convention respect the basic principles of the Antarctic Treaty, as well as the conservation measures recommended by the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. There's no explicit obligation going the other way requiring parties to the Antarctic Treaty to respect measures adopted by the CAMLAR Commission, but in practice, measures adopted through the consultative meeting have encouraged Antarctic Treaty parties to do so. That, however, is not a legally binding obligation in the same way that CAMLAR parties do have under the CAMLAR Convention. Perhaps more importantly for my presentation today, there is a duty placed by each of these treaties on the relevant institutions to cooperate in order to avoid inconsistency. And there is, in fact, significant engagement between the institutions on many issues. However, the observation I'd just like to make at this stage is the avoidance of inconsistency is only one part of ensuring integrated management. And in fact, in many instances, we actually need proactive coordination and coherence between measures adopted by different institutions so that they are actually approaching the issues in coherent and positive ways rather than just avoiding conflicting measures. And I think it's in that respect that practice in the region may still be lacking, and it's a particularly challenging request from the institutions. I want to use marine protected areas as a key example, particularly because it's an issue on which integrated management is particularly important. If marine protected areas are to be effective, then they need to protect the designated ecosystems from all relevant threats. Now, marine protected areas are a tool used both under the Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty and Annex 4, as I mentioned earlier. Then there are two types of marine protected areas that are used, specially protected Antarctic areas and especially managed Antarctic areas. to date, there's about 6 marine protected areas that have been adopted as specially protected, which is the greater form of protection under the environmental protocol. Similarly, CAMLAR has its own general framework, which is implicit in the CAMLAR Convention itself, but has been developed through conservation measures developed by the CAMLAR Convention. In fact, what's proclaimed often to be the first high seas MPA was the South Shetland Shelf MPA adopted by CAMLAR about a decade ago. The question that I want to ask about this is, how do these two institutions engage with each other in developing these measures? It's most clear from the perspective of the environmental protocol, which places an express requirement on the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting to get the consent of the Antarctic Commission for Living Resources before marine protected areas are developed. So the idea of engagement is at the designation stage is explicitly built into the treaty framework. The same is not necessarily true for MPAs adopted by the Commission. There's no express requirement to gain the consent of the Antarctic Consultative Meeting, but there is a recognition in the relevant conservation measure that once designation has happened, the CAMLAR Commission should consider engaging with other relevant institutions, including those within the Antarctic Treaty System, to further the objectives of the MPA. In practice, there has been some engagement on these issues, but what's clearly lacking is a systematic engagement on the broader principles and objectives that may inform a coherent MPA network in the Southern Ocean. This comes back to the point earlier I made about this is more than just ensuring a lack of it, preventing inconsistency. What we are looking for is coherence. And this is a point that has been flagged in performance reviews of the CAMLAR Commission. In the first performance review in 2008, the panel noted that despite the provisions in the convention, cooperation at a practical level had been challenging. About 10 years later, the second performance review noted some progress. In particular, it flagged better working relationships between the Scientific Committee of CAMLAR and the Committee of Environmental Protection under the Environmental Protocol. But it did recommend further work on this, or further action in this area, in particular holding periodic meetings of the political organs of these two regimes. And I think this is an area where lessons could potentially be learned from other regions, and I'm thinking particularly of the Northeast Atlantic and the practice between OSPAR and NIAF. But that practice has also shown that there are significant practical challenges in achieving this sort of coordination. In part, it's about political will, and but also there are logistical challenges to this kind of coordination too. And the literature relating to the collective arrangement in the Northeast Atlantic has emphasized that this is a long game, and it requires the slow building of trust and mutual confidence between regimes. So we can't expect progress necessarily on this overnight. But we could also look to other examples from the international legal framework to see where different institutions have worked collaboratively with each other. One example I would flag would be work, for example, between the International Maritime Organization and the International Labour Organization on protection of seafarers, where those institutions have formed joint working groups and actually produced joint documents which have then been adopted by each institution. And in a sense, that's exactly what we need if we're to have coherent MPAs at a regional level, institutions actually producing joint programs of work and joint plans, as challenging as that is. Bringing my presentation to an end, and I'm not going to have much chance to discuss this in detail, but as I flagged earlier, there's also a need to bring in other institutions in this respect. both global institutions such as the International Maritime Organization, and certainly the regional bodies in the Southern Ocean have ad hocly engaged with the International Maritime Organization over the years. And so there is some working relationship there. And they also flagged up the work between regional fisheries management organizations and CAMLAR, which again has been done through bilateral memorandum of understandings. One proposal that was made recently at CAMLAR meeting was to broaden out the process and create what the EU proposed was a Southern Ocean cooperation platform to bring all of these bodies together in a single forum. Now, it was rejected at the time and questioned whether or not this would add anything to what types of cooperation that's already going on. But I would argue quite strongly that that type of process is exactly what is needed in this region. Perhaps not just between CAMLAR and the other RFMOs, but bringing in the whole range of actors in the region to have coordinated conversations about ecosystem management in the Southern Ocean. I'm aware my time has run out, but I just also want to flag up a number of other speakers throughout the day have highlighted it. But clearly in the background here, we have negotiations towards a new legally binding instrument for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And one of the issues there is cooperation and coordination. And a new legally binding instrument could potentially have impacts on how these sorts of processes could work. But I'll maybe leave that for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison, for highlighting for us the practical challenges in achieving coordination between different legal regimes for integrated management plans